Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Parisa, and I'm a junior at Yale, and I'm a youth delegate here with the World Women Davos Agenda, and I'm very excited to announce our next session. It's called Seforall, Powering on the Green Industrial Revolution, Closing the Skills Gap for the Energy Transition. And I'm honored to introduce our session moderator, Ms. ALINA TRABATTONI, international journalist.
I welcome our wonderful speakers. We have two of them present. The third one is stuck in traffic, as happens in Davos and is quite common these days. But please do come on board. Thank you. Here we are, and we're enjoying quite nice weather here in Davos. I'm actually tempted to lighten up the load as well. So, but anyway, this is day 3, and it's been a very, very intense session here at the World Women Foundation, and I think it's been very interesting for all. We've had great speakers, and even better ones this afternoon, I like to say. But I'm going to jump straight in, because we literally have 30 minutes for this session, and we've got a lot to go through. We have here with us Sarah Steinberg, Head of Global Public Policy and Partnerships at LinkedIn. And also with us is Yvonne Ruff, Senior Partner at Roland Berger. And we're waiting for our third speaker, Jessica CHAIJAYA, Head of Public Affairs at Tera Capital. But in the meantime, I'm going to kick it right off and start with Sarah, with yourself. We're going to be looking at data-driven perspectives on green skills demand and opportunities that arise from these. So Sarah, my first question is, which green and green adjacent skills are growing fastest on LinkedIn? And where will these trends take us in coming years, in the next 5-10 years? What opportunities will they offer?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this. At LinkedIn, we have been looking at green skills supply and demand for the last several years. And you asked about trends. So I'll start with the big sort of overarching trends. And the first one that I would highlight is I cannot overstate the extent to which human capital is going to be a limiting factor in making the transition to a sustainable economy. So for the 4th year in a row, we found that demand for green skills grew at twice the rate as supply. And the second sort of key trend that we're seeing is that for the first year in a row in our latest Green Skills report, we saw that green skills are actually predominantly in roles that we wouldn't traditionally consider green jobs. So I think this just sort of underscores the extent to which green skills are becoming sort of core business functions and necessary for businesses to really grow and compete and manage uncertainty in the environment that we're in. So things like operational efficiency, supply chains and procurement, energy management, waste reduction, adaptability to climate change are all skills that are growing incredibly quickly on LinkedIn. And then the third trend that I would highlight that is relevant here today and for all of us is there's a gender component to this too. So we find that women make up less than 1/3 of the green workforce. And this is challenging for a couple of reasons. I mean, on the first hand, if we don't have the supply of green talent to meet the demand, governments are not going to be able to meet their climate commitments. Businesses are not going to be able to manage this uncertainty and compete. And workers, especially women, are not going to be able to take advantage of the economic opportunity afforded by these good in-demand jobs.
That's very interesting, and it's very interesting to hear that data because I know 32% of energy workers are female. So, and green obviously falls within that, but it's actually aligned with the entire sector. So that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. It was very interesting. So Yvonne, same sort of topic, but looking at it from a different angle. How can companies and investors in energy infrastructure and transport plan their climate-related investments and business changes so they both make money from climate action and at the same time build the green skills needed to deliver these plans at scale, of course, because, you know, that's key as well, that's crucial as well. especially in emerging markets, which are the sort of frontiers, the pioneering frontiers at the moment?
Thank you, and thank you, first of all, for a very warm welcome. Honored to be here. Interesting question. I think there's various aspects about it. Now, businesses obviously need to make profits and make money. And I think sustainable energy for all, specifically green energy, provides a lot of opportunity, especially in emerging markets, who potentially could leapfrog from traditionally more fossil-based energy systems to more green electrified systems, because you could theoretically, if you don't have fossil fuel already in your country and an established infrastructure, you could arguably jump to electric quicker. Now, obviously, you need the skills to do that. And companies are challenged not only for the question, are the investment frameworks correct here? Can I earn money? Is my investment de-risked? Do I have the right framework conditions to actually operate and invest there? But do I have the people and the skills there? And if I just zoom into that area, I think it's a great opportunity for companies to review their procurement processes and ask themselves, how much can I help emerging markets incentivize skills building by putting forward a procurement system that looks at skills first, i.e. weave in skills in your CapEx programs. So when you procure certain components for PV, for wind, technology, or for other green energies, do you make sure that you take on board suppliers and companies who focus on risk, on skills and build skills within their company, or who ask for certifications and who bring on board locals and hire locally to actually provide the systems to build all that? I think that's definitely an angle to look at. Obviously, as I said, the framework conditions to move into these countries need to be there in any case.
That's fascinating because, of course, in the 90s, the same thing happened, the leapfrogging with telecoms. Countries that didn't have an established, solid, capillary telecom network actually just jumped to mobile phones and skipped the whole, problematic aging infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So we could see that replicated.
Absolutely. And if you allow me, I'd like to take us back even one more decade, because there's a very interesting perspective that I've read this from a brilliant journalist in the Financial Times last week. And some of you might have also, but they uncovered again how China became a leader in renewable energy technology, in PV. They're challenging global producers on wind turbines. And the interesting perspective was in the 80s, the Danish wind engineering company, Bonus Energy, had delivered 13 turbines to a company in China called Changying Wind Energy Company, which was a predecessor to Goldwind. And they are very well a global leader, basically, in the industry now. And then actually Danida, the Danish Development Corporation, even brought in funding to help them build the skills, develop the technology to, as you know now, become the most dominant provider in the solar value chain. And that just shows, if you systematically work on skills transition and support that with the right framework and the right incentives from a government side, transition of skills can happen very, very successfully, right? Of course, you can argue scale was involved. Not every country will be able to copy that. But if you bring companies together in a more integrated trading zone, for example, in emerging markets, I think there's more potential than currently is being leveraged.
Very interesting, very interesting. Sarah, can I ask you, how can governments and businesses integrate green job preparedness into climate, into energy and industrial strategies as well, so that the green skills become a sort of mainstream competency within the workforce?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is the key challenge. And the first thing I would say is workforce strategy needs to be an essential component of climate and energy strategy. So that means if you're a company, your HR needs to be working with your sustainability practice. If you're a government, your departments of labor and education need to be working closely with your departments of energy. And it means, you know, updating education and training systems so that they're really addressing the newest skills that need to be, that are in demand in order to, you know, make this transition. Track green skills through the data that you're collecting, whether you're a business or a government. Obviously, LinkedIn has some of that data, but that will allow you to measure how well the workforce is able to meet that demand. And then the final thing I would emphasize, which I think is really important if you think about getting more women and underrepresented groups into some of these good in-demand jobs, is really moving to a more skills-based approach to hiring and talent development. So instead of just looking at, oh, does someone have this degree that I expect them to have, or does someone have this previous job title that I expect them to have, really moving to look at what a worker brings to a job in terms of what they can actually do. And when you do that, that really enables people who otherwise would not be seen as candidates for some of these roles that incorporate green skills to actually move into those and be considered for those roles.
Yvonne, what do you think? I mean, what sort of leadership capabilities inside companies and public institutions are needed to truly phase out high-carbon business models, the high-carbon business models we're all grappling with here, and accelerate this transformation?
It's a great question, and there's no easy answer to it, because it always depends on which company, which country you operate in. Now, the challenge we all have in that sense is fossil-based energies or high-carbon energies are seemingly cheap. If you develop a megawatt hour of electricity out of natural gas, you pay a fraction of the price I'm talking, than with electricity. But if you look at the actual cost, the cost of producing one megawatt hour of electricity is fairly low. The problem is that in some countries, for good reasons, you have all sorts of levies and taxes and burdens upon it that make it more expensive. So you need to have that fact or those facts very clearly in mind and know how it links to skills and building the skills and be able to communicate it as a leader to actually build a vision to transition away, and I'm specifically using that term from COP, I think 28 it was,
yes,
to transition away to more renewable energy and from fossil fuels. Now, and it's hard. Why? Because fossil fuels in some countries enable the availability of energy, which is a human right. And it's the basis for education, it's the basis for economic growth, for inclusion, for many things. So it's not easy to just move away from fossil fuels. Yeah. You need a very clear plan. You need to understand systematically how you involve technology, how you bring in companies and investors, how you bring in financiers, how you build the skills to deliver, because renewable energy is a very local business, right? You need to, of course, you can import the components and the turbines, etc. But ideally, you actually develop parts of a value chain. At least you need to install it in the various countries, and you need to maintain and operate them. So
and
you need
also
skills
there's
there.
the consensus, the local consensus, the territory consensus that's
Absolutely.
needed. Sorry, I interrupted you there, but it's fascinating.
You're totally right. And coming from a country, I come from Germany, where that consensus is not always there for the simplest things
Italy.
like an electricity grid. That's a really, really important point. And I think it goes back to your question about emerging markets. If you have leaders there who understand the leapfrog opportunity, the opportunity to create jobs, involve women, involve communities into these areas, it's extremely helpful. Yeah, but I think you need to have a vision, the skills to communicate the facts, to understand, and then to communicate the facts, as well as and we've had that in the panel before, you need to understand that these investments take a long time, and the payoff may take a long time. And it's not necessarily something like that a financier and a private equity or an infra fund would look at, or a private equity would look at, right? So You need that long-term horizon and the resilience to just see it through. And that's not easy.
Not easy at all. Not easy at all. But we'll get there. Sarah, what approaches are most promising for ensuring that high-value green skills, for example, like R&D, data, IP, that these are accessible to women, to young people, and to talent, of course, in the global south and emerging markets, in fast-growing economies, but that are very behind, sort of the Western world, rather than remaining concentrated in the Western world in a few regions, and obviously demographics as well?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I would point to, I mentioned earlier that for the first time this year when we analyzed green skills globally, we saw that green skills are now predominantly in roles that wouldn't be considered green jobs. So first of all, I would lean into that and really think about building those green skills across the entire value chain, so incorporating those really high value green skills that I talked about earlier into supply chains and procurement, into finance, into technology. And in doing so, you are able to sort of build those skills within the population in order to be able to eventually move to some of those, more high-value R&D sort of hubs. And then the second thing I would emphasize is, again, just making that shift to a more skills-based labor market. So whether people earn these skills in the formal or the informal economy, if workers have the ability to signal, hey, I can do this, and employers can sort of see that and value that, then it opens up opportunities for many populations who otherwise wouldn't be considered for some of these roles. So for example, we looked at the utility industry in India, and we found that when you take a skills-based approach to looking at the workforce, as opposed to that more traditional looking at just credentials and job titles, you actually expand the population of workers who would be qualified for utility jobs, that you increase the share of women in that group by 22%. So this is a really powerful shift that we can make to build those skills in developing countries, and also recognize them and create opportunities for workers who otherwise wouldn't be considered for some of these roles.
Excellent, excellent. I will ask you another question, and I'm keeping an eye on the door, hoping that Jessica gets here, and she'll have a slew of questions as soon as she gets here. But Yvonne, how can industrial strategies and just transition plans be designed so that the reskilling and social protection for workers in high carbon sectors are embedded into the system from the very start?
A good question, but I just wanted to react quickly to what you've said, Sarah. Super interesting facts that you see in LinkedIn. I think that's a challenge to all of the corporates to actually think of the HR and recruiting mechanisms and the logic of which they actually bring people in. And it opens up so many more dimensions for diversity, for women, for different kinds of angles if you look at the skills-based approach. And
bringing people in and also advancing people within an organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it just also shows there is a readiness to change, to bring in transition, to bring in different perspectives. You're basically enabling the organization to modernize themselves, right, in a way. Yeah. On the just transition part, I think we have a challenge, of course, and politicians have a challenge. It's always easy to point fingers at politicians and say, guys, why don't you do more for this or that? Why don't you speak the truth about electric vehicles just being more sensible rather than combustion engine vehicles from an environmental perspective? But if you take it from a social perspective, jobs are related to certain industries and sectors, and also to high carbon sectors. And as mentioned, with availability of cheap energy, it's similar with jobs. You can't just flick a switch and then you've rebuilt an industry. So to make a transition very sensibly and responsibly, I think is a big challenge. You need to support, first of all, clear planning. Which skills do you need? When? At which point and where. And there are various tools that also we operate with our clients who can then plan strategically ahead, what do I need where. To have that transparency, I think, is really important first. Secondly, to make sure that those skills that are not longer needed, the people get the opportunity to retrain. with certification programs, ideally short ones to start with, but that you have a set of support measures to guide a transition and to support those who cannot or will not or for whatever reason cannot make the transition. It's also still a responsibility to support those. And there are scientific studies who say, yes, you can use skills from the fossil-based sector in the green sector. Many are engineers, many are data-driven. I mean, there's a good base in the learning of many of these technologies. So it's a matter of supporting that and incentivizing it right.
Does that go to support young people as well that are going into the market or that have a very few years of work experience behind them? Because they're also facing a very complicated world. I'm seeing it from the universities. I hold some sessions, I teach some sessions at Cambridge University. And, the last 2-3 years have been very, very complicated for young graduates.
We've also heard it from Renata in the previous panel. We see it in our own company. The number of applicants for an internship program is breathtaking. And it's really, if you know someone and they ask you for support and you see these great CVs and you cannot help them in a way because of X, Y, Z, that's really terrible. So we have that challenge. The industry has that challenge, societies have that challenge to make sure we bring in young people and use this talent despite automation potential and others. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think we don't have any news of Jessica yet, but I might ask you a last question, Sarah, if I may, and then we may need to wrap up. But we are actually quite close to the end. So, Sarah, how can data from labor platforms be used to recognize and value skills developed in informal and care economies and to create pathways into formal green jobs?
Yeah, so at LinkedIn, I'm part of a team called the Economic Graph, and our whole purpose is to work with governments and international organizations to share some of this data to help inform policy and programming. So first of all, please feel free to reach out to me if that's sort of aligned with what you're working on. We share this data with organizations like the World Bank, the OECD, in order to help design policies. And I would say, LinkedIn is also the platform where workers can signal those skills to employers, regardless of where they sort of gained those. And we see a dramatic increase in the share of members on LinkedIn who are adding skills to their profile, particularly among Gen Z, among workers who have green skills, among workers who have emerging tech skills. So we see that on the worker side, tons of demand for that sort of shift to skills-based hiring. Where we're seeing a lag is on the employer side. So we are seeing an increase in employers using more skills-based hiring, particularly among small and medium-sized businesses, which are kind of leading the charge. But still, more work needs to be done. We actually partnered with OECD earlier this year to understand how skills-based hiring is being used around in OECD member states. And what we found is that when you use a skills-based approach to searching for a job, you actually open up 3 times as many jobs as would otherwise be available to you. And when employers use a skills-based approach to hiring, they're actually more likely to make a quality hire. And so, again, can't emphasize enough as we're thinking about how do we close that gap? How do we get the green skills that we need to make the transition to a sustainable economy? That we're really thinking about the focus on skills and not just credentials, previous job titles.
Well, a huge round of applause to our fantastic speakers. I'm going to be reaching out for the Green Report, the LinkedIn Green Report. So I encourage everyone else to read it as well. It sounds very interesting. And we'll call it a day at this point. Unfortunately, our third speaker was not able to make it, but we had more than enough to go by. Thank you.
Thank you.